Four inseparable friends: Jake, the level-headed leader; Lily, the cautious but brave one; Ethan, the jokester; and Sam, the quiet but dependable guy, decided to go on an adventurous camping trip deep in Ravenwood Forest. The forest had a reputation for being cursed, a claim locals often made but never explained. To them, it sounded like a perfect backdrop for spooky stories and Instagram-worthy moments. Friday morning, they piled into Jake's car, packed with a tent, supplies, and high spirits. As they entered the forest, the paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt, before disappearing altogether. Using a map and GPS, Jake led them on foot deeper into the wilderness, determined to find an untouched clearing. The first sign of trouble came when the GPS began malfunctioning, switching off and rerouting them in bizarre ways. "It's just a signal issue," Jake reassured them. But as the trees grew denser, the air colder, and the trail narrower, Lily's unease deepened. "I don't like this," she muttered, glancing at the endless canopy of trees above. "Don't chicken out now, Lily," Ethan teased, throwing his arm around her. "We'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen?" By the time they found a suitable clearing by a quiet stream, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows. They pitched their tent and started a fire, laughing and sharing ghost stories. Ethan kept tossing small rocks into the darkness, enjoying the startled jumps from his friends. As the fire crackled, Lily noticed something peculiar, a faint, rhythmic whistling coming from the trees. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Ethan said, smirking. But when everyone fell silent, the sound came again, long, drawn-out notes, as if someone were whistling a haunting tune. It seemed to come from no particular direction, yet it was unmistakable. "It's the wind," Jake said, though his eyes darted nervously around the camp. They tried to laugh it off, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Ethan insisted on leaving a lantern lit outside the tent, just in case, joking that it would scare off the boogeyman. At around 3 a.m., Sam woke up needing to relieve himself. Groggy and half asleep, he grabbed the lantern and ventured into the woods. When the sun began to rise, Jake, Lily, and Ethan realized Sam hadn't returned. They assumed he'd fallen asleep outside and called out for him. Their voices echoed back, unanswered. Fanning out to search, they soon found the lantern lying on the ground, still lit. But there was no sign of Sam. Around the lantern were strange circular footprints, large, clawed, and unlike anything they'd ever seen. "What the hell made these?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "We need to go back to the car," Lily said firmly. "Something's wrong." Jake hesitated. "Sam could still be out here. We can't leave him behind." Ethan agreed, albeit reluctantly. They packed up camp and decided to follow the stream, thinking it might lead them to Sam. But as they walked, the forest grew eerily unfamiliar. Trails they thought they'd taken earlier were now overgrown or completely gone. By sunset, they realized they were hopelessly lost. Exhausted and tense, they set up camp again in a random clearing. The fire did little to ease their nerves, especially when they began hearing movement in the woods, soft rustling, like footsteps, but too scattered and deliberate to be an animal. "Stay close to the fire," Jake warned, clutching the knife he always carried in his pack. As the hours passed, the noises grew louder. At one point, Ethan swore he saw a figure standing just beyond the firelight, its eyes faintly reflecting the flames. But when Jake aimed his flashlight, there was nothing there. Then came the scratches, Long, deliberate claw marks appeared on the tent's fabric, as if something or someone was testing it. By morning, Ethan had had enough. He declared he was leaving, compass in hand, and stormed off despite Jake's protests. "He won't make it," Lily whispered once Ethan was out of earshot. Hours later, they heard a piercing scream echo through the forest. Ethan's voice. "Jake," Lily whispered, clutching his arm. "We're being hunted." Jake didn't respond. He was staring at the edge of the clearing, where the trees seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. With no firewood left and their lantern dimming, Jake and Lily huddled together in the tent. The forest came alive with sounds, branches snapping, whispers, and guttural growls. Suddenly the tent was yanked violently, and they were dragged outside, sprawling into the dirt. In the dim glow of the lantern, they saw it. A towering, emaciated figure with limbs that bent unnaturally, its hollow, glowing eyes fixated on them as it let out a low, guttural growl. The air reeked of decay. "Run!" Jake yelled, charging at the creature with his knife. Lily hesitated, screaming his name, but he shouted again, "Go!" She turned and fled, the sounds of Jake's struggle echoing behind her, followed by a chilling silence. Lily ran blindly through the forest, her breath ragged and her legs aching. She didn't stop until she collapsed by a mossy boulder, trembling in the pre-dawn light. Hours later, she stumbled upon a dirt road where an old truck stopped to pick her up. The driver, a weathered man with a grim expression, listened as she babbled about what had happened. "You're lucky to be alive," he said quietly. "No one survives that forest, not for long." Before she could respond, she noticed something in the rearview mirror, a faint figure standing at the forest's edge, watching them leave. The authorities searched Ravenwood Forest but found no trace of Jake, Ethan, or Sam. The only thing they recovered was the lantern still burning brightly despite being out of fuel. Lily moved away from the area, haunted by nightmares of hollow eyes and twisted shadows. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she swore she could still hear the faint whistling tune from the forest. Emma and Mark had been married for 5 years, and life in the city had worn them down. For their anniversary, they decided to go on a peaceful camping trip to reconnect and recharge. Mark, an avid outdoor enthusiast, convinced Emma to venture into the remote Black Hollow Forest, a sprawling wilderness known for its stunning views and ominous folklore. Locals spoke of strange disappearances and unsettling whispers that plagued the forest, but Mark brushed off the stories as myths to deter tourists. Emma, more cautious, hesitated but relented when Mark promised it would be an unforgettable trip. The couple arrived at Black Hollow on a sunny Friday morning. The entrance to the forest was marked by an old weathered sign that read, "Enter at your own risk." Emma shivered as she stared at it. "Just dramatic marketing," Mark said with a grin, shouldering their gear. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller and denser, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was cooler here, almost unnaturally so, and the silence felt oppressive. Even the birds seemed to avoid this part of the woods. After hiking for hours, they found a small clearing near a crystal-clear stream and set up camp. Despite the serene setting, Emma couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. After dinner, they sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa and reminiscing about their first dates. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to close in around them. The rustling of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch became unnervingly frequent. Probably deer, Mark said, though his voice lacked confidence. As they crawled into their tent, Emma froze. She swore she heard a faint whisper, distant but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" she asked, gripping Mark's arm. "Hear what?" "A voice. It sounded like someone calling my name." Mark listened for a moment but heard nothing. "It's just your imagination. You're tired." Emma reluctantly agreed, but as she lay awake, staring at the fabric of the tent, the whispers returned, closer this time. She squeezed her eyes shut and didn't sleep. The couple awoke to find their camp in disarray. Their backpacks had been unzipped, the contents scattered across the ground. Mark assumed a raccoon was responsible, but Emma pointed out that none of the food had been touched. Only their clothes and personal items had been disturbed. As they cleaned up, Emma noticed something strange on the nearby trees. Long, deep scratches, too high up to be made by an animal. "We're not alone out here," she whispered. Mark dismissed her concerns, trying to maintain a calm demeanor, but Emma noticed him glancing nervously over his shoulder. Determined to shake off the tension, Mark suggested a hike to explore the area. As they walked, Emma realized the forest felt different, almost alive. The trees seemed closer together, and the path they had taken earlier was now unfamiliar. After hours of walking in circles, Mark admitted they were lost. Emma's anxiety grew when they passed a tree marked with the same deep scratches they had seen at camp. "That's impossible," Mark muttered. "We've been heading straight." The couple decided to return to their campsite, but as night fell, they realized they couldn't find their way back. With no choice but to set up camp wherever they were, they built a small fire and huddled close. The silence of the forest was deafening, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig. As Emma stared into the darkness, she saw them, eyes. At first she thought it was a reflection of the fire, but they didn't blink or move. "Mark," she whispered, nudging him. "Do you see that?" He turned, his face pale as he nodded. The eyes disappeared, but the sense of being watched intensified. Later, as they tried to sleep, Emma was jolted awake by a loud, guttural growl just outside the tent. Mark grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously. He shined the light around, but saw nothing. "Whatever it was, it's gone," he said, though his shaking hands betrayed his fear. The next morning, they found strange symbols etched into the ground around their tent. The shapes were crude but deliberate, circles, lines, and crosses that seemed to form a pattern. "What the hell is this?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "Someone's messing with us," Emma said. "No, this is something else," Mark replied, his confidence from the previous day gone. Their only option was to keep moving. They packed quickly and left, trying to find their way back to the car. As they hiked, Emma spotted something in the distance, a figure standing still between the trees. It was tall and dark, with unnaturally long limbs. "Mark," she whispered, pointing. But when Mark looked, the figure was gone. Hours passed, and they found themselves back in the same clearing they had camped in the first night. Emma broke down, crying, while Mark cursed under his breath. "We're trapped," she sobbed. "No, we just need to stay calm," Mark said, though his voice shook. That night, the whispers returned, louder and closer than ever. This time, they were unmistakable, soft, raspy voices calling their names. Emma begged Mark to leave the tent, but he refused. The whispers grew into chants, a low guttural hum that surrounded them. Suddenly, the tent collapsed. Emma screamed as they were dragged out by an unseen force. The fire had gone out, plunging them into complete darkness. "Run!" Mark shouted, pushing Emma forward. She hesitated but obeyed, sprinting into the forest. Behind her, she heard Mark's screams, then silence. Emma ran blindly until she stumbled into a dirt road, where she was found by a passing ranger. She babbled about what had happened, but when the ranger took her back to the campsite, there was no sign of Mark or their belongings. All they found were the symbols carved into the trees, and Mark's flashlight, still flickering weakly. Weeks later, Emma moved out of the city, too traumatized to stay. One night she received a package with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid of her and Mark at the campsite. In the background, barely visible, was the tall shadow figure, watching them. She never felt safe again. Catherine, a 32-year-old freelance photographer, was known for her adventurous spirit. After a stressful month of deadlines, she decided to escape the city for a solo camping trip. Her destination was Grey Pines Forest, a sprawling wilderness rarely visited due to rumors of disappearances. The locals called it the Crossing, a place where people were said to vanish into another world. Catherine wasn't one to believe in myths, dismissing them as campfire tales. Her goal was to capture the raw beauty of nature, and Grey Pines offered an untouched canvas. Armed with her camera, tent, and supplies, she set out on a crisp autumn morning. The forest was dense and unusually quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. As she ventured deeper, Catherine noticed something peculiar. The air seemed heavier, almost as if the forest itself was alive. She chose a clearing near a small lake to set up her camp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretched unnaturally long and the forest became eerily still. That night, Catherine sat by the fire, reviewing the photos she'd taken. To her surprise, some of the images were distorted. Trees appeared twisted, and faint silhouettes stood in the background, shapes she hadn't noticed while shooting. "It's just a glitch," she muttered, though a chill ran down her spine. As darkness enveloped the forest, Catherine prepared for bed. While zipping up her tent, she heard faint whispers carried by the wind. "Hello?" she called out, her voice breaking the silence. The whispers stopped abruptly. Convinced it was her imagination, she climbed into her sleeping bag. But as she lay there, the whispers returned, closer this time. They weren't in any language she recognized, a strange mix of hissing and murmurs. Her heart pounded as she peeked outside the tent. Nothing but the darkness greeted her, yet the whispers persisted. The next morning, Catherine decided to explore the forest and shake off the unsettling events of the night. She followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods, hoping to find unique spots to photograph. Hours passed, but the scenery began to feel repetitive. Trees stood in perfect alignment, and the same gnarled oak tree seemed to appear at every turn. The more she walked, the more disoriented she became. Finally, she stumbled upon a strange sight, an archway formed by two twisted trees. The bark was blackened, and strange symbols were carved into the wood. Driven by curiosity, Catherine stepped through the archway. As she did, the air shifted, and the forest seemed to change. The colors became muted, the light dimmer. She felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as if she had crossed into another realm. The forest on the other side was alien, yet familiar. The trees were impossibly tall, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sky. The air was filled with an unnatural hum, and the ground pulsed faintly beneath her feet. Catherine noticed figures in the distance, tall, elongated shapes with glowing eyes. They moved fluidly, almost floating between the trees. Panic set in, and she turned to leave, but the archway was gone. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent. This time they seemed to come from inside her head, urging her to stay, to explore. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. Instead of an answer, a shadow emerged from the trees. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its body unnaturally thin. The creature tilted its head, studying her with hollow eyes. Catherine bolted. Running blindly through the forest, Catherine realized the terrain was shifting beneath her. Trails disappeared, trees uprooted themselves, and the whispers became deafening. She tripped and fell, her camera shattering on a rock. As she scrambled to her feet, she found herself in a clearing. At the center was a large stone altar, covered in the same strange symbols as the archway. Surrounding the altar were remnants of belongings, torn backpacks, rusted watches, and faded photographs. Catherine realized she wasn't the first person to stumble into this place. Before she could react, the shadowy figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, watching silently. The air grew colder, and her breath came out in visible puffs. "Let me go!" she screamed, clutching the broken camera as if it could protect her. As the figures closed in, Catherine felt a sharp pain in her head. Memories flooded her mind of her childhood, her parents, and moments she had long forgotten. It was as if the forest was rifling through her life. A voice, deep and resonant, spoke in her mind. "Leave something behind, and you may go." She didn't understand. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "A memory, a part of you. Choose or stay forever." Desperate, Catherine shouted, "Take anything, just let me go." The shadows surrounded her, and she felt an overwhelming sense of loss, like a piece of her soul was being ripped away. Catherine woke up on the forest floor, the morning sun streaming through the trees. The forest was normal again, the oppressive weight gone. She stumbled back to her campsite, grabbed her belongings, and fled. When she reached her car, she realized her hands were trembling. Her mind felt foggy, and she couldn't remember large chunks of her life, her childhood, her first job, even the reason she had come to the forest in the first place. She drove straight to the nearest town, where she tried to explain what had happened. The locals listened with grim expressions. "You're lucky you came back," one old man said. "Most don't." Word spread about Catherine's experience, and Grey Pines Forest became infamous. People began reporting similar encounters, disappearing paths, strange symbols, and whispers that lured them deeper. Authorities closed the forest, declaring it a danger zone, but those who ventured in despite the warnings never returned. As for Catherine, she never recovered fully. Her memory loss persisted, and she avoided forests for the rest of her life. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she heard whispers again, soft, beckoning her to return. Grey Pines became known as the Cursed Crossing, a place where reality frayed, and those who entered risked losing themselves forever.